Watkins's Unsung Hero. Last month, Merle and I had just finished a reading at Peter's Beer Garden. Judy Casper, my comrade in cheerless pain, had a question for me. Do you just tell Polish stories? No, I replied. My dad was not Polish, so I'm also half not Polish. Judy asked if I'd ever heard of a man named George T. Smith. Like everyone else in Winona, I had not. As a proud great-granddaughter of George T. Smith, Judy introduced me to the story of Watkins's unsung hero. George Thomas Smith was born June 6, 1872 in Winona, the first child of Irving Smith and the former Margaret Conway, both born in Pennsylvania. The 1875 Minnesota census shows the Smiths living near the intersection of Mankato and East Front. That's right, the very foot of Mankato, among their Polish, Bohemian, and German neighbors. Like everyone else on the foot of Mankato, George T. Smith could have just wallowed in the ocean of cheerless pain. But he swam for it instead, and guess what? He made it. Everybody in Winona knows the Watkins story. In 1868, J.R. Watkins of Plainview started selling a medicine called Dr. Ward's liniment. In 1885, he relocated to the railroad hub of Winona, Minnesota, from which he planned to supply a nationwide network of salesmen. By 1887, he was doing well enough to hire his very first employee. This was a 15-year-old boy from the foot of Mankato named George T. Smith. In later years, George would joke that J.R. Watkins hired him as a bottle washer. In fact, he spent 60 years doing it all as Watkins's director of shipping and receiving. In a world without UPS, FedEx, freeways, or container trains, George T. Smith was a logistical genius. For 60 years, George was the ultimate Watkins Company man. But more importantly, he was a family man. In 1893, George married a German farm girl named Matilda Richter. Around 1900, George and Tilly moved to a handsome but not fancy house at 463 East 4th Street. Sadly, Tilly passed away in 1913, leaving George with 3 daughters and a son: Florence, Clara, Grace, and Harry. Most widowers remarried at once. It took George 8 years to find the right woman. His second wife was an East End Polish woman in her 20s named Romualda Watkowski. Their daughter Ruth was born in 1923. Romualda was a bookkeeper at Watkins, a janitor's daughter. Not quite a high society match. But George had that East End work ethic, and so did Romualda. They were Watkins loyalists. George was also president of the Watkins Employee Association. A century later, it might sound odd that everyday workers would love their employer, but there was always something about Watkins. That was a very big part of the company's amazing success. George T. Smith never went on safaris like Grace Watkins King and her husband E.L. He never built a big fancy mansion along the river. No fancy mausoleums either. The Smith family lies in a simple plot at St. Mary's Cemetery, like the humble, hard-working people they were. In 1937, Watkins Company showed George the love for his 50th anniversary with the company. He was presented a new car by Grace Watkins King herself, out on Liberty Street, with everyone in the building looking on. The paper didn't say what kind of car it was, but I vote for a 1937 Studebaker Dictator, a solid middle-class car with a stout 6-cylinder engine and a name soon to go out of popularity. When the paper interviewed George, he just talked about Watkins and his early days in Winona. All he said about himself was that he planned to go on working. He didn't know what else to do with his life. Of course, George T. Smith did a lot of other things with his life. He was a devoted husband and father. When he died in 1955, he was survived by his wife, 5 children, 11 grandchildren, and 19 great-grandchildren. He was a member of the Winona County Old Settlers. He was a former president of the Winona Red Men's Lodge. How big of a deal was that? Well, in 1918, the Red Men bought the Philharmonic Hall at Franklin East 4th. That's how big. They renamed this august building, which burned down in 1967, the Red Men's Wigwam. George T. Smith was a big deal in Winona that whole time. He just refused to act like it. He's still remembered today. The Watkins Museum has a display dedicated to J.R. Watkins and his nephew Paul, complete with oil portraits and all. But this wall also has a framed reprint of a newspaper article about the logistics genius who was the unsung hero of the company, the man who kept salesmen selling, a poor working-class kid from the Foot of Mankato who got his start as a 15-year-old bottle washer. His descendants live among us today. Remember his name, George Thomas Smith.